Blessed Bean by D&D Seat, also known as Has Gone. Summary. Things were going great for Thomas. After years of waiting, life had finally delivered his soulmate. Unfortunately, their honeymoon period is interrupted when he made the stupid mistake of being seen by the human who shared his apartment. Still, as dire as the situation was, he wasn't expecting the event to lead to their first real fight since meeting each other. Of course, he also wasn't expecting Remy to be hiding a very big secret. The rating for this fic is teen and up, with no archive warnings apply. Additional tags for alternate universe soulmates, alternate universe borrowers fusion, references to the borrowers, GT, soul bond, magic, fae and fairies, fairy godparents, blessings, size shifting, secrets, secret identity, ambiguous relationships, developing relationship, developing friendships, arguing, fear, trust, confessions, and light angst. Thomas paced breathlessly, struggling and largely failing to keep himself on the cooler edge of panic. He wasn't any kind of stranger to panic, of course. No borrower was, but until 3 weeks ago, he had only had himself to worry about. 3 weeks since all of his waiting, all the risks he had taken while staying so long in the apartment he had settled, had finally paid off. 3 weeks ago, he had finally met his soulmate. Everyone's soulmate bond presented itself differently. For some, they were lucky enough to have a compass simply pointing the way to their other half. Others were blessed with their soulmate's thoughts in the back of their head, or their image reflected in the mirror. Some made it easier to find your soulmate than others. Some people were so unlucky that their soulmate's identity would only be revealed with any certainty at the time of their death. But the world was a very big place indeed, and it was often cruel, and those most unlucky never even met their soulmates at all. Very few borrowers ever did. Thomas considered himself neither particularly lucky nor unlucky. He hadn't been blessed with the knowledge of his soulmate's name or their likeness, and he hadn't been given the means to go searching. But what he had been gifted was the knowledge of where he and his soulmate would meet, if not when. He had been in between homes when he discovered it. He had made a temporary camp in a dusty and obviously forgotten corner of a supply closet on the bottom floor of a random apartment building. He hadn't been planning to search for a home in that building, intending on putting more distance between himself and his former residence, just in case the roach infestation that had driven his previous host to fumigate might have spread. But he had gone out borrowing for supplies that night, and in the kitchen of one of those apartments he had seen it. His soul fire. Their soul fire. It had lit up the room like a beacon with light only he and his soulmate would be able to see. A swirling orb of colorless fire, hovering just on the edge of the kitchen counter. It cast no heat until he got up close. Warm, but never hot, even when he reached out to touch it. And he had known from the moment he laid his eyes on it that it was in that exact spot that he and his soulmate would finally meet. His next course of action was obvious. Thomas had set about making his home in that apartment. He had built his nest itself in the walls of the kitchen, with a door on the top of the cabinets that hung over the counter so he could sit and keep watch over his soul fire, waiting for the day when his other half would see it, and hopefully, stick around long enough for them to meet each other at last. That had been more than 4 years ago. Since that day, Thomas had come to feel that the knowledge he had been given was a bit of a double-edged sword, because it was one thing to know where he and his soulmate would meet, but without knowing when, there was no telling how long he would be left to wait. Staying in one place could be chancy for a borrower. That was always true, but it was especially the case when they decided to make their home in an apartment. Beans tended to stay in houses. They had that luxury. A house to a bean was a home, one they usually intended, or at least preferred, to be permanent. But an apartment was often like his sad little camp in the janitor's closet had been, just a place to lay their head until they were able to move on to something better. Living in a house, there was usually ample time to learn about the being you were living with, time to get used to their quirks, adapt to the changes in their schedule along with them. In an apartment, however, there was no telling how long any given being would stay. Sometimes he had lived with the same being for more than a year, sometimes for a couple of months. One had only stayed a single month, and that wasn't much time at all to begin to learn their habits. This building hadn't allowed pets, but that hadn't stopped that particular roommate, and it had very nearly spelled the end of Thomas's stay. It was easy to get spotted when you didn't know the being you were living with, when you didn't know what time they got up for whatever it was they did out in the world, or when they turned in for bed when they were done, when you didn't know how light a sleeper they were, if they got up at night with any regularity or not. Thomas had dealt with far too many close calls while living in this apartment. One of the past residents had been a sleepwalker, and while that ultimately hadn't come back to bite him, it had still very nearly given him a heart attack. A smarter borrower would have moved on for more stable corners to hide in by now, but Thomas had stuck it out, through sleepwalking, through illicit cats, through the bean that set off the smoke alarm every morning just using the toaster, and the one who had decided to try and learn the trombone to impress a girl, and the one who never remembered to bring food into the house, and the one who had regularly stayed awake for more than 24 hours straight staring at the glowing screen on his desk. His current housemate had to be the worst of the lot. Given how irregular his schedule was, Thomas wasn't sure if the guy even knew how clocks worked. If he had a job that he worked at outside of the house, the hours were either very flexible, or else he was one of those humans who owned a thing. That meant that other humans did all the work for him. Thomas never knew when the bean was coming home, or how long he would stay up once he did. There was no guessing what hour he would choose to sleep, or where he would finally fall asleep, or how long he would stay asleep once he had. In trying to adapt, Thomas's own habits had become nearly as erratic, which hadn't had the best impact on his skills or his quality of life. In fact, there had been so many close calls that Thomas was beginning to worry his hair might start going gray just from the stress. Fortunately, most of those near misses had happened while Thomas was keeping watch over the soul fire from his perch above the cabinets. And most of the time, when the bean was standing in that spot, it was because he was laser-focused on making his coffee. Thomas was half convinced this human was literally blind before he had his first cup of the day. But in the end, all of the stress, all of the strain, all of the fear had finally paid off. It had been worth it, because 3 weeks ago, he had finally met Remy. There hadn't been any warning that the day would be any different. Thomas had woken up, eaten, got ready to scout in hopes of discovering his bean's most likely schedule for the day, when he had stepped out onto the cabinets and seen him standing there, another borrower, poised on the edge of the counter, right where their soul fire was burning. Thomas didn't think he had ever scaled a distance so quickly as he had in his rush to join the other on the countertop. And, in his haste, he hadn't been at all quiet, because the other borrower had turned to watch him approach. They both had been so nervous, too nervous for the first few moments, to risk trying to touch, because they were both terrified that, against all odds, they somehow might have been wrong. But when they had finally closed those last couple of inches, reaching out for each other, and the moment their fingers touched, the connection had flared, their soul fire had flared, shimmering a soft, iridescent pink before vanishing. Now, their soul fire burned inside both their chests where it belonged, a warmth that was at its strongest when they were together, and that would always be felt, even when they were apart. Remy hadn't had anything back home that couldn't be left to wait, which meant they had the luxury of time to get to know each other better before either of them would need to think about where they went next. Time to learn about their bond and discover what it was meant to become, what they were meant to be to each other, as it strengthened between them. And the last 3 weeks had been the best days of Thomas's life, until he had managed to ruin it by being seen at the worst possible moment. Thomas had done plenty of planning ahead, but his stores could only support 2 for so long without being restocked. And while he had managed to go borrowing once or twice during the weeks that Remy was with him, eventually things had started to run dry. The bean that he lived with ate elsewhere a lot of the time, and with the exception of a few staples, he only ever brought in enough food into the house to last for a few days to about a week. They had at least lucked out in that the bean seemed unusually scarce. It had made borrowing easy, but without the human around to replenish his own stocks, it also meant that he could only borrow so much without risking that the borrowings would be noticed. But eventually, Remy had to leave, just long enough to retrieve the things he didn't want to be without from the home he had been neglecting. He would bring them back with him, and then they could both decide together what came next. And, while Remy was gone, the bean had finally returned, with groceries, thankfully, as well as a few unexpected odds and ends that he could hope might be a boon toward their preparations once his soulmate returned. Only, hopped up on the rush of his sudden optimism, Thomas had been just a little too eager to investigate the spoils of the bean's recent outing. He had gotten sloppy. He had almost gotten himself caught, and he knew that he had definitely been spotted. He had hoped they would have more time, but now there was a ticking clock. As soon as Remy got back, they needed to leave. That had been more than 2 hours ago. Thomas had already packed up all of the most essential items from around his home. They wouldn't have the luxury of a gradual move, but at least they would have food and tools and blankets for starting wherever they went next. Maybe he could go and live in Remy's home. It wasn't a place his soulmate was attached to, but even having a temporary nest over their heads while they planned their next move was better than having no nest at all. Thomas paced frantically, trying to reassure himself. Everything was up in the air right now, but the one thing he did know for certain was that Remy was still safe. As long as he could still feel their soul fire burning steadily in his chest, there was hope. He just needed to wait for his soulmate to return, and hope it was soon, before the bean could arrange whatever plans he had now that he knew the walls were occupied. Optimism was something that Thomas had always worked hard to keep alive, but at least finding his soulmate had certainly made it a whole lot easier. Outside the walls, the house was eerily silent. Either the bean had left once again, or whatever he was doing was quiet enough for the sounds not to penetrate into the walls themselves. Thomas tried not to think about which might honestly be worse. But finally, the nerve-wracking silence was broken up by the sounds of movement from the ladder leading up to his nest above the kitchen cabinets, and Thomas watched with his heart in his throat as Remy's head emerged from the opening below. He barely waited until Remy had both his feet firmly on the floor before he ran to throw his arms around him. "Whoa, hey," Remy said with half a laugh. "Keep up like that and a guy'll start to think you missed him." Despite the tension of the past hours, or, maybe even because of it, Thomas couldn't help a weak little laugh of his own. If there was one thing he had learned about Remy over the past weeks, it was that his tendency toward irreverence was often as infectious as it was frustrating. He was quick to shove it aside, however, the situation before them sobering him almost immediately. "I'm sorry," Thomas said as he pulled back. "I know you just got back, and I'm sure you've got your things somewhere, but we need to leave as soon as possible." For several moments, Remy just looked at him, uncertainly, Thomas thought, from that little line frowning between his eyes. He took a slow breath then, and asked, "Why?" Which, Thomas supposed that was fair. He deserved an explanation. Thomas was the one who had put them in danger, after all. "I screwed up," he admitted. "I got seen. I thought... It doesn't matter now. We can discuss it later, but right now we need to leave before the bean decides what he's going to do." "Do?" Remy asked, plainly confused. "What do you think he's going to do?" Thomas shuddered. "I've been trying not to think about it," he said, "but I'm sure it wouldn't be anything good. I mean, maybe nothing? Maybe. But it's not like we can afford to take that chance. He left the room almost as soon as he saw me. I don't know if he's still here somewhere or if he's out, but he could be out getting traps, cages even, or just calling an exterminator where we wouldn't hear. The last home I had was gassed, Remy. I almost didn't get out in time." He was starting to tremble again, thinking about it, but Remy's arms closed around him, pulling him close. "Hey, easy," he soothed. "Take it easy." "I've been trying, or at least managing to put the nerves to good use. I've got most of the essentials packed up to take already. We can leave as soon as you're ready to go. I know we were supposed to have more time to plan where we wanted to go, but maybe we can go to your old nest?" "Thomas, Remy hesitated slightly. "I don't have a nest anywhere. There's nowhere else to go." Thomas squeezed his shoulder. "That's all right. We'll find somewhere. Maybe we wouldn't even have to go far. I haven't checked out the other apartments in ages, but there might be somewhere we can stay for a while before we move on. Or the closet I first stayed in when I came here. That might still have a safe corner to hide in, at least until we get the chance to—" "Thomas," Remy said again. Tomothy, listen. We don't need to go anywhere else. We don't need anywhere else to go. We can stay here." "Remy, we can't. I was seen. The human knows we're here, and he isn't going to do anything." "You don't know that." "I do." "You can't know that." "Babes, I can. Now that he knows we're here, he already knew you were here." Thomas's heart stuttered in his chest. "What?" "He already knows. He knows, and I promise you it's safe." "Remy, did you talk to the human?" Remy opened his mouth, but when no answer came out, Thomas didn't wait. You can't do that. That is so dangerous. Why would you?" Only he was halted in his panicked scramble to understand by Remy's helpless laugh. "Shit, babes," Remy said, running a hand over his face. "You're really not making this easy." "Making what easy, Remy? Nothing about this should be easy." "Explaining," Remy said at last. Thomas watched him silently for a moment, waiting tensely for whatever his explanation was meant to be. But after a moment, Remy let out a sigh. He lifted his hands to Thomas's shoulders and, gently, moved him toward the small beanbag he sometimes used as a couch or a chair. "Just sit, okay?" Remy said. "Sit and give me just 20 minutes, all right? Can I have that long to explain to you why we're not in danger?" Thomas glanced at the beanbag as if it might offer him an argument not to, but finally settled down, prepared, at least in theory, to listen to whatever explanation his soulmate had to offer. Remy closed one of the boxes Thomas had been pulling supplies out of and dragged it closer so he could sit down in front of him. But he said nothing at first, simply waiting. "All right," Thomas said, after finally settling down. "Explain." Remy blew out a slow breath and seemed to take a few seconds to ready himself before he spoke. "Okay, so this is going to be kind of a weird, long story, but I promise you it's the truth," Remy began. "But to start, you know about how all soul bonds are different, right? Not just how they prove themselves, but what they actually mean." "Of course," Thomas said, confused where this was going. "Well, my mom has kind of a strange one," Remy said. "You know how some people have a name, like that they know or that shows up on their skin? She had her soulmate's name on her skin, and he had hers, which isn't that unusual, only he was kind of an A-class dick because he sold it off." "He sold it?" Thomas asked, confused. "He sold a name?" "Her name," Remy said tensely. "He sold her name, and her bond with it." "That doesn't make any sense, Remy," Thomas said. "You can't sell a soul bond or a name. Who would buy a name?" And then he saw Remy tense briefly, as if bracing himself for a reaction, before he answered, "A fairy." "What?" "My mom's asshole soulmate sold her name and her bond to a fairy." "There's no such thing as—" Pretty sure if you asked the average human, they'd say the same thing about borrowers. Thomas cut himself off at the interruption and took a slow breath. Okay, Thomas said, not bothering to disguise his growing frustration. Let's pretend for 1 second that I'm willing to believe you that fairies exist, and that one of them bought your mother's soul bond. What does that have to do with the fact that the human who lives in this apartment saw me? I have a fairy godfather, Remy said. No, yes. Just, please, would you listen? Fine, Thomas said. Finish your fairy tale about your fairy godmother, and then give me one good reason why I shouldn't just walk out of here without you. Godfather, Remy emphasized, but continued forward before Thomas could offer his complaint. The fairy is my mother's soulmate now. Actually a pretty decent sort, as long as you don't cross him. Definitely better than that other deadbeat, that's for sure. Not sure what her bond with her soulmate was meant to be, but her bond with my godfather is very weird, I'm not going to lie, but it's got perks. Perks. I'm blessed. Blessed, Thomas echoed blankly. He blessed me, Remy said. I was given 3 blessings when I was born. Right. Distantly, Thomas thought he should probably be concerned by just how easily his earlier terror had been smothered by whatever it was he was feeling at the moment. Frustration, confusion, and more than a little anger. It wasn't that he thought life with his soulmate would be perfect. Even soulmates argued. He just hadn't expected their first argument to be so bizarre. At this point, he didn't know if Remy was delusional or if he just thought that Thomas was an idiot. But at this point, he thought he'd prefer the first. Even if it was dangerous for Remy to disregard the danger that the being still posed, it was better than knowing that his own soulmate already had that little respect for him. The first 2 were kind of basic, Remy explained. Health, wealth, and happiness are the traditional 3. Very useful, but a little bland. In the end, they decided to give me the first 2. Well, health and prosperity, which is apparently different by Fae standards than wealth. And they decided to keep the 3rd in reserve for when I was old enough to decide what I wanted happiness to look like, so I could choose that blessing myself. Which, cool, right? But that's a lot of pressure to grow up with a blessing like that in your back pocket. Remy had more or less been rambling through most of this, but here he hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, softer, and uncharacteristically serious. It made Thomas uneasy. A blessing from a powerful magical being isn't something you use lightly, Remy said. And I kind of always wanted to wait until we met, you know? So that we could figure out what happiness looked like together. But the moment I first saw you... He cut himself off abruptly, looking away from Thomas for the first time during the conversation, staring down at his hands as he continued. It wasn't the day we touched, Remy confessed slowly. When our bond was formed, I'd seen you a few times before then. But if there was one thing my godfather drilled into my head, it's that when you see something unusual, possibly supernatural, sometimes your best first reaction is no reaction at all. You just pretend you haven't seen unless there isn't another option. Because most creatures that want your attention will try and get it, and those that don't will either hide or maybe curse you for seeing them. So at first I just kept a subtle eye out, as much as I could. And as soon as I realized you were keeping watch over our soul fire, I knew. His eyes returned to Thomas at last, his expression more open and terrified than Thomas had seen from him, all but begging for his understanding. I knew what my blessing had to be, Remy said. I wanted us to be able to be together, in whatever form we both wanted, because that was what happiness was going to look like. And that was where Thomas, who had been doing his honest best to follow along with the bizarre story that Remy was trying to tell him, lost the plot entirely. I don't understand, Thomas admitted, confused. What are you saying, Remy? I'm saying that the human who lives here isn't a danger to you, Remy said slowly. He would never be a danger to you. Because he's me. For several seconds, all Thomas could do was stare. Because even compared with the last several minutes of what he had been told, this was nuts. It was nuts, and they couldn't afford to delay leaving for much longer. Thomas stood and moved toward his bags. Remy was quick to rise as well, quick to meet him with a hand on his shoulder to stop him. Thomas pulled away, turning around. This really isn't funny. He had hardly found his voice when Remy cut him off again, pleading. It isn't a joke, babe, he said. I swear. Just let me prove it. I can show you. Let me prove to you that I'm not lying. And then let me prove that you can trust me. I know that won't be easy, but would you please just let me try? And Thomas didn't know what else he could have said then. Fine. Then prove it. Remy froze for a moment, but then he nodded shakily. All right, he said, quietly, then with a little more strength. All right, then. Just come with me. He gestured to the opening that led to the ladder, the one which led out from the nest and into the walls and eventually into the open spaces of the apartment itself. And it made sense, at least so far as any of it could make sense. If Remy were actually intending to prove what he was claiming, then sure, it made sense. But what he was claiming was impossible. The only other reason that Thomas could imagine being led out into the open when they had everything to fear from the being living in the apartment was if... No. He stopped himself from completing that thought. The situation was bad, but Remy was his soulmate. And maybe they hadn't known each other long enough to learn what kind of soulmates they would be, but still. Call him foolish, call him naive, but Thomas still thought Remy deserved to be extended more faith than that. He couldn't imagine living in a world where his soulmate, his other half, the person destined to be an integral part of his life, would betray him. Though, as they made their way down the ladder, through the walls and to the carefully disguised opening that led out onto the counter itself, he did his best not to think about the story that Remy had just told him, the story that hinged on a soulmate who had done just that. Remy was nervous. Like, holy shit, he was nervous. Okay, no, scratch that. Remy was terrified. Nervous was what he had felt in the aftermath of seeing Thomas scamper out of his grocery bag like the hounds of hell were after him. Nervousness was knowing how badly he had scared him, and knowing that, by the time he got around to changing out of his normal clothes and made it up to Thomas's nest, the borrower would have worked himself up into some kind of panic. Nervousness was knowing he was going to have to tell the truth so much earlier than he had planned, before he even honestly had a plan for telling it. Nervousness had been watching his soulmate take in his confession with a confused, skeptical expression and knowing that the minute he started to actually believe it was going to be so much worse. Now, having to actually put his money, or blessings, where his mouth was and prove it, he was terrified. He knew it was going to happen someday, and sooner would probably have been better, but he was in no way prepared for it. He didn't know what he was going to do with himself if this went poorly. There was no way to avoid frightening Thomas at this point. More than anything, Remy didn't want to frighten him away. Wait. Remy came up short at Thomas's softly spoken order. They hadn't yet stepped out of the entrance onto the counter. Looking at him now, the tension running itself through every line of his body was nearly painful, but Thomas gestured for Remy to wait as he approached the opening. Let me go out and check first. I'll give you the all clear. Remy couldn't help the soft smile. Thomas never had liked letting him be the first one to step out of the walls, his argument always being that he had lived in the apartment for a long time and knew by now exactly what to listen for to know that someone was coming. And that had been true. Remy had only been sharing this apartment with him for a handful of months. Thomas had been far too polite to do more than gently suggest a few improvements as far as his skills at moving around quietly were concerned, which were trash, and they both knew it. If they were going out together, Thomas always went out first. And Remy knew that Thomas was more convinced now than ever that there was danger out there, just waiting to pounce. He just hoped his soulmate didn't think that Remy was knowingly leading him into danger now. Eventually, Thomas's face returned to the opening, and he waved Remy outside. Remy squinted as he stepped out onto the counter, wishing, not for the first time, that there might have been some way to justify wearing his shades. It was late afternoon, so even with the kitchen lights off, there was plenty of sunlight coming through the windows to see by. It was always strange coming out here, much stranger than it was staying inside the walls with Thomas. Everything that should have been familiar seemed so alien from this angle. Even something as simple as an unexpected shadow managed to feel menacing. It was intimidating, but it was also humbling, because it was so easy for him to feel like Thomas might be blowing his own fears out of proportion. But all he had to do was remind himself that Thomas had lived his entire life seeing things from this angle. It had become much harder to dismiss the proportions of his fears after that. He hadn't meant to dismiss them up in the nest either. He simply hadn't known what to do. He hadn't had much time to think about how he was going to handle Thomas's panic, and he hadn't been willing to wait too long before joining him. And as much as he had feared having to explain, of frightening him away with the truth, he had feared just as much, perhaps more so, the thought that he might not even get the chance, that Thomas, pressured after being seen, might not wait for him, that he might just run, perhaps with only the hopes that their bond might lead them back together, but with the knowledge that they might never meet again. Remy hadn't been willing to take the risk. He also hadn't wanted to lie, not to his soulmate. Technically, he hadn't. Well, maybe he had told about a dozen or so tiny lies supporting the larger one, the one he had never officially told, because it had been easy just to let Thomas assume that because he was seeing someone borrower-sized and roughly borrower-shaped and soul-bound to a borrower, that they were one, because of course that made so much more sense than the hand they had been dealt, didn't it? Effectively, it was a lie, even if it technically wasn't. At least not the way his godfather had ever reckoned things. Because the Fae couldn't lie, but he could certainly spin his words into knots so that you believed what he wanted you to believe anyway. So, here they were. And here he was, standing on his kitchen counter, hoping he wasn't about to lose his soulmate's trust forever. Or cause him to have a heart attack. That was probably the worst-case scenario. He walked to the edge of the counter, where their soul fire had once burned. Thomas followed. Looking down off the edge, it certainly looked like a fatal fall to him. Though at a borrower's size, as light as they were, it might not be. It still wouldn't have been any fun, though. That he was sure of. "Okay, so I know you can't actually promise not to panic," Remy said, because if nothing else, he could be realistic. "But can you at least promise you'll try not to run?" "I can promise I'll try," Thomas said. "But what?" And Remy didn't wait, didn't let himself second-guess or talk himself out of it, and he didn't offer Thomas any warning because he knew it would be useless. He just jumped. He was still new to this whole thing, but so far he was of the opinion that it was better to get it over with quickly. Changing slowly might give Thomas more time to get used to the idea, but it would also give him more time to panic. In any case, going slowly tended to make him dizzy. He had quickly learned to do it with his eyes closed either way, but even then, changing slowly screwed with his balance, and toppling over like a tree in front of his soulmate was probably the least helpful thing he could do at the moment. He remembered the first time he had changed, just after receiving the blessing. He had been so out of it from motion sickness he had collapsed in a tiny heap. His godfather had been amused to no end. Remy hadn't been lying. Deceit was miles better than that other asshole, but at the end of the day, he was still kind of a dick. Because he was quick, it was over before his feet could hit the ground, the change in mass only briefly causing his ankles to twinge on landing. And when he opened his eyes, when he stood to his full height, he saw Thomas staring back at him from the countertop. Thomas, wave-faced and trembling, his eyes so wide with terror that even now Remy could see it in his face. But he hadn't run. Not yet. Remy could only hope it was because he was trying not to, that he wasn't too scared to even move. Remy stared back for what was probably too long, frozen with fear and indecision of his own, terrified that if he even moved in the slightest, if he even breathed wrong, that it might be enough to finally scare his soulmate away. Remy took a soft breath to try and steady himself, focusing on the soft burn of their soul fire, a hand absently rising to his chest. On the counter in front of him, he saw Thomas do the same, and he still couldn't will himself to move just yet, or even speak, but he tried to at least offer his best attempt at a reassuring smile. It was difficult to tell from this perspective whether his attempt landed or not, but at least he hadn't seemed to make things any worse. "So," Remy finally managed, spreading his hands a little helplessly, "this is me." He tried to keep his voice at about medium in terms of volume, but reining himself in hadn't ever been his strong suit. It also didn't stop the movement from making Thomas flinch. "Wait, hold on." Thomas watched him warily as Remy took a step back, pulling a chair from the kitchen table. He turned it around in front of the counter and slowly sat down, resting his arms on the edge of the counter. It wasn't much, but sitting down had at least dropped a few feet off the distance that Thomas had to crane his head up to look at him. Even then, it still struck him how very small Thomas was. This was the closest he had ever been to him for any length of time at his normal size, the first time he had been close enough to easily judge the difference. If he set a flat hand on edge down on the countertop, Thomas wouldn't even be able to look over the top of it. And through all of his moving around, Thomas still hadn't run. But he also hadn't said a word either. "So, I guess the ball is kind of in your court here," Remy said. "I'm sorry I wasn't more honest with you at the start, but I didn't want to scare you away, and I don't expect you to trust me right away, but please let me try." He watched closely, tensely, as Thomas watched him, clearly wrestling with his fear and whatever other emotions he was feeling. The conflict boded well for Remy, he thought, though it certainly looked unpleasant. And it was difficult to be patient when his soulmate was right there, only inches away. But those inches were so much larger on Thomas's end, and with every other difference that occupied the space between them, it might as well have been miles. He knew he needed to wait, that Thomas needed to be the one to close that distance. And it did happen. Slowly, but it happened. First with a cautious step forward, and then another. The shaking had stopped, at least as far as Remy could see, but Thomas was still so wary in his approach. His eyes kept darting around, as if not sure what part of Remy he should be watching. He supposed there was a lot to keep an eye on. But he waited, as still as he could manage, until Thomas stood about an inch or two away. He waited, and then, very slowly, he uncurled his index finger towards him. Thomas eyed it, the hand, the finger outstretched, as if he were being offered the world's most threatening and surreal handshake, which, all right, yeah, fair enough. But eventually, even Remy could see the effort he took with his next breath, squaring his shoulders and steeling himself as he reached out a hand. His touch felt like almost nothing to Remy. Thomas's full palm splayed out against the tip of his finger, but the contact certainly seemed to solidify something for Thomas, because he finally looked up to meet his eye. "All right," Thomas said shakily. I'll give you a chance." And it was all Remy could do at that moment not to sag from his relief. "Great. All right. Cool," he managed with utmost poise. "So does that mean I can come back down and give you a hug? 'Cause I'm not gonna lie, this is kind of stressing me out too." As relieving as Thomas's words had been, it was a laugh he managed, which finally allowed Remy to believe they might be all right. Eventually. If he could laugh at this, then Remy could believe that Thomas would one day forgive him, that he might one day be able to accept Remy in his entirety without fear. Though as he shrunk back down and climbed his way back up the back of the chair and onto the countertop, he made up his mind that perhaps Other explanations could wait. Explanations about how Fae didn't naturally have souls, and thus got a little funny about soulmates. How to them, at least on a metaphysical level, what belonged to one soulmate belonged to the other. That the same quality that had allowed his father's bargain to count as valid enough for the fairy to accept his mother's name meant that, by the very same laws, every blessing given by his godfather applied to his soulmate equally. And that might just be too large a pill for the borrower to swallow at the moment. Pun embarrassingly intended. So yeah, probably just best to wait. And that's the end of Blessed Bean by D&D Seat.